Hi, if you're just joining us, I'm Matilda Gregg, the lead organiser of this workshop. This paper is part of a panel called Activism and Exclusion, which highlights the stories of women warriors who history books and media coverage have typically overlooked. The three videos in this panel, though all set in very different contexts, each show women fighting for inclusion in the category of soldier or warrior, and for the power to define for themselves what those words mean. Watch on for stories of female IRA prisoners, polka dot prison uniforms, and the protest power of graffiti.
Our next speaker is Samantha Haddad, who graduated from Mount Holyoke College in 2019 with a degree in history and art history. She is currently pursuing her master's at New York University in Irish and Irish American Studies, where she researches the relationship between feminism, LGBTQ activism, and republicanism. Her paper is entitled Guerrilla Girls, Wonder Women, and Menstruating Mothers, Iconographies of IRA Women in Armagh Gaol, 1970 to 1980. Thank you very much.
So I would like to begin with a brief story. In 2011, Irish auctioneer Whites sold a matchstick tower made by former IRA member and former Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness for €5,200. Auctioneers described the piece as a well-executed piece of art. In addition to craft pieces like the matchstick tower that are found around the world, another object from prison saturated global media. Images. Despite not being crafted by hand, make no mistake, these pictures were manufactured. The proliferation of such objects, such images, raised the question, where is the material culture of female IRA prisoners in the iconographies of the Northern Irish Troubles? Before diving into deep visual analysis of craft and photography from Armagh Gaol in Northern Ireland, it would be constructive to lay out the background and the political atmosphere of Northern Irish prison life, as well as provide a brief overview of the traditional pace of prison craft and photography, centering, of course, on women's history. Prior to the outbreak of the ethno-nationalist Northern Irish Troubles in 1969, at any given time there were no more than 12 women in Armagh Women's Prison. They wore prison uniforms of a polka dot shirt, a brown skirt, and stockings. The female inmates did prison work, and at the jail there were exclusively female guards. Father Raymond Murray, chaplain to Armagh, stated the guards had been good to them. Following 1970, however, Father Murray stated the whole nature of the prison changed. The prisoners, who used to be in Armagh for petty crimes, became politically motivated, and the crimes were now related to the outbreak of conflict, participating in rent strikes, wearing combat clothing, or even just carrying Hurleys. As the violence escalated, however, so did the women's crimes. By 1973, the offenses that landed women in Armagh included arson, shootings, bombings, and murder. Due to the influx of IRA prisoners, Westminster, who is now governing Northern Ireland at this point, had to contend with a large Irish Catholic prison population, whose numbers and agitation were increasing. After a hunger strike in Crumlin Road Jail in May and June of 1972, Secretary of Northern Ireland William Whitelaw conceded political status to the prisoners. This meant prisoners who committed political offenses or crimes related to the deteriorating Northern Irish situation now received special privileges, more frequent visits, parcels, and educational opportunities. Free association and exemption from prison work were the most important because this allowed prisoners to be virtually self-sufficient military squads within the prison, which opened up time for political organization as well as educational efforts. The years following the introduction of political status were ones of relative calm within the women's prison. Under Officer Commanding or OC Eileen Hickey, the women in Armagh forged camaraderie, not just as IRA volunteers, but as women as well. During their time in Armagh, the A Company adopted the motto, "Liberty is strength." Because of free association under special category or political status, women filled their time with Irish history, Irish language classes, and Irish literature. One activity that we will be focusing on today that the women in Armagh occupied themselves with was prison craft. Before we closely examine material culture from the prison of political status, I would like to briefly examine the male culture surrounding Northern Irish prison craft. The brilliant work of both Mike Maloney on prison art and Dr. Laura McAkney on material culture at Longkesh more specifically provides useful theoretical frameworks to understand women's craft at Armagh. Mike Maloney lines out basic premises of prison art. In prison, inmates will get bored and will do art to pass the time, and despite the artistry of the craft, prisoners would not consider themselves artists, even if by all intents and purposes others define their works as art. As proposed by McCackney, the most productive analysis of men's prison class is the omnipresence of them, how much of a cultural and material presence they had in the Republican community in Ireland and abroad. Using simple media found in prison, men created bags, thatched cottages, harps, hurleys, sticks, crosses, and a variety of other products to both gift to loved ones and to sell. This money was then reinvested in charities that supported prisoners and their families. Because men's craft could be found everywhere, from houses in West Belfast to bars in New York, the last legacy and indeed study of prison craft is heavily gendered. Using Professor McCackney's thesis that prison material culture provides insight into the negotiation of power between the incarcerated subject and the prison environment, I would like to examine women's material culture, in which I argue we can also see the negotiation of power, women's negotiation of their place as female soldiers, both within the colonial prison system itself as well as male-dominated republicanism at large. As you can see here, women also produced a variety of craft. Here you can see a piece of embroidery work and a flag made on a bedsheet that says, "Liberty is strength." Additionally, there's a crocheted come into Mon hat, a part of the official, unofficial IRA women's uniform in prison. According to Armagh's second-in-command, Sheila Dara, women in prison were not allowed the same materials as men. Women, therefore, did not have access to wood and to leather. Women unsuccessfully protested this British-imposed policy, but regardless, women of Armagh subverted these mediums through content that complicated the narrative of femininity, war, and the state. Art forms like embroidery and crocheting have traditionally been diminished as artistic practice because they were viewed as women's work, and therefore could not be considered a significant art form, i.e. they were not worthy of being analyzed for deeper interpretation. This canon was most famously challenged by feminist art piece The Dinner Party, where embroidery and ceramics, once belittled because of their functional and decorative status, literally and figuratively give women a place at the table. I'm not suggesting this art piece is directly tied to the work of Armagh, but it does establish both in the micro and the macro a subversion of feminine art and craft practice to establish a specifically politicized femininity, which I do believe the women in Armagh are engaging with. One preferred subject was portraits of Irish Republican women. Here, this is the famous 1916 leader, Countess Constance Markievicz. Additionally, this piece indicates that women are representing themselves as IRA members, not as secondary auxiliary support, as they were commonly assumed in the early years of Troubles, but rather they are depicting themselves as active combatants. Women also combined both national iconography and the female form to bridge women's issues with the Republican cause. For example, one woman turned the Easter lily into a vaginal form in a work titled "A Nation Once Again," after the famous Republican song. The Easter lily is the center of Ireland and signaling its rebirth, very literally a representation of a nation once again. Many of these works were also framed with embroidered flowers, adding additional feminine detail to the works. Additionally, it is interesting that Bobby Sands specifically writes about the women in Armagh as flowers. Sands states that these IRA members were the flowers that flourished despite every attempt to destroy the beauty and strength of the flora. But of course, more symbolically, he is referring to Irish Republican womanhood at large. While there are definitely objectifying elements to this statement, and I don't know if the Armagh prisoners would describe themselves as delicate flowers, the feminine detailing around powerful and strong images further highlights that the women believe in their contribution to the Republican movement, and to them, gender difference is indeed a strength to the Republican movement, not a weakness. One of the most striking pieces from Armagh is this embroidered tablecloth. Here, the women of A Company Armagh signed the work with their names along with their crimes, most of them violent. Again, for women trying to establish themselves as equal members of the IRA, There's a radical embracement of feminine art and craft forms combined with the violence most readily associated with male members of the paramilitary. Women displayed their commitment to the means necessary to achieve the goal of the organization, even if during the beginning of the Troubles, male members did not believe they were capable of carrying out violent missions themselves. Lastly, perhaps the most overt prison craft that signals an early interest in connecting with the ideals of women's liberation is this banner that reaffirms the prisoners' commitment and support of the ideals behind the United Nations 1975 International Women's Year. This art piece, along with documentation of prisoners reading feminist literature such as Spare Rib, the British feminist magazine, support what would become the more overt goals towards a gender-inclusive republicanism. Women's prison clap displayed early signs of proto-feminist consciousness that became central to prison life in the early 1980s through the Armagh Dirty protest. In the mid-1970s, the natures of Northern Irish prisons changed dramatically, becoming a lightning rod for political disputes for the next 20 years. In a response to mounting violence in the early years of the decade and the rapid escalation of IRA attacks on mainland Britain, the Westminster Gardiner Committee took a hardline position on policing in the North to diminish IRA legitimacy. The most important tactic for our purposes today was criminalization, which as of March 1st, 1976, denied IRA prisoners political status. By removing the political status of IRA prisoners, making them now so-called ordinary decent criminals, Republicans charged with violent offenses did not enjoy the same privileges allotted to IRA members before March 1st. Therefore, they were now expected to do prison work and wear the prison uniform. With the policy of criminalization in Northern Ireland, the British government had unknowingly started an arms race with the IRA. Every event spurred another, with the climax being 10 emaciated bodies starving to death in the H blocks in 1981. These series of protests began with the blanket men, where male prisoners refused to wear the prison uniform and only a blanket, then escalating to the dirty protests, where male prisoners refused to bathe or slop out any bodily waste in their cell, and their last protest tactic was hunger strike. Part of the population, and indeed scholarly community's fascination with the men's dirty protest, is derived from the iconography the protest produced. People were captivated by images and videos of men with long hair, wearing nothing more than a simple blanket surrounded by their own filth. Such images provoked powerful protests of people taking to the streets in Belfast, Dublin, and London in nothing but blankets. In line with the beliefs of Catholic republicanism, the men on the blocks, particularly leaders like Bobby Sands, became Christ-like figures. The nudity and the violence of this martyr iconography resonated with a religious and nationalistic population. The iconography is so widespread and recognizable that even famous artist Richard Hamilton captured it in this fine art piece. The women's protest, however, was not simply the suffering of the Virgin Mary. While women advocated for the rights of IRA mothers in prison, women's self-imaging and artistic practice acted to dismantle previous male and church-dominated iconographies of women, especially Republican women, where men conformed to them. After criminalization, the condition in Armagh deteriorated. Grief exacerbated the tension in the prison due to the loss of political status, but ultimately the prison would erupt on February 7th, 1980, with a day that became known as Black February. On this day, in an effort to confiscate contraband clothing, guards from Longkesh were brought to the women's prison, and the encounter turned violent. Male guards in riot gear assaulted the female prisoners, with many of the women reporting highly sexualized forms of gender-based violence. Because of the gender-based violence women face, their response was gendered as well. On February 8th, 1980, the women's dirty protest began. They refused to bathe, they did not slap out, but most importantly, to quote Nell McCafferty, there's menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh prison. Prior to the Armagh dirty protest, menstruation had a complicated place in Irish Republicans' women's relationships with both British and Irish men. There are oral histories where women document British soldiers painting Virgin Mary statues with red on her crotch to indicate menstruation. And during raids, Catholic women reported being denied proper menstrual products, leaving them bleeding and humiliated. Menstruation was also a contentious subject in prison, where women did not have access to adequate hygiene products. and there are reports that tampons or pads were removed, viewed, and then thrown at prisoners by guards. Additionally, Irish men, specifically in the IRA, also had difficulty dealing with the complications that arose from IRA women's sexuality and reproductive capabilities as indicated through menstruation. There were cases in the Republican movement where female IRA prisoners were reprimanded for getting pregnant out of wedlock, or for husbands of female IRA prisoners being frustrated that prison halted their ability to have children. Even IRA member Brenda Murphy recalls the complete shame of the natural process of female soldiers. She states, "These men who had killed been in prison and they couldn't even say the word period." Despite the way Irish women's bodies, sexuality, and reproductive capabilities had been used against them by both British and Irish men, the Armagh Dirty Protest was a radical embracement of gender difference and the female body as a tactic of protest. Like how many women had expressed themselves as IRA members and as women before the loss of political status, women continued to use artistic practice to connect womanhood to their Republican prison experience. Inmates used menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh Gaol as a means to further blend the materiality of their reproductive bodies with their political goals, not just as IRA members, but as women demanding more recognition from the Republican movement. One way this was done was through so-called interior decorating. Sheila Dara and other IRA members recall, "We all made designs, we drew wee flowers, or we wrote up the raw." Another Armagh inmate described drawing Wonder Woman and her symbol on the cell. Through the already highly gendered performance of the Armagh Dirty Protest itself, menstrual blood became the medium of prison art. Like the act of embroidery, the term interior decorating is subversive in that it politicizes the role of decorating one's environment, which has often been ascribed to women and therefore has been diminished as important work. Through not only the protest itself, but the artistic expression it produced, the menstruating Irish female body, shamed by both British forces and IRA men, is reclaimed to be seen and used as a material for protest and gender and political expression. The photography of the women in Armagh also helps present the way female IRA members image themselves as IRA members, as protesters, and women within the confines of the jail. The women of Armagh were not allotted the same press coverage as the men on the blocks, but eventually women did smuggle in a camera and staged a variety of portraits. Many captured the daily lives of women exercising, running military drills, or feeding their babies. One of the most famous and widely circulated images to emerge from Armagh was OC Mairead Farrell standing defiantly in front of the menstrual-covered walls of her cell. This is not the photograph of a victim that the Republican movement tried to portray them as. Rather, Farrell radiated a confidence and a defiance of both the British prison system and the ideals of women in male-dominated republicanism by standing in front of a menstrual-covered wall. I chose the photo of Mairead Farrell in addition to the photo of Jacqueline Moore, one of the number of photos of mothers and babies in prison. I think the two photos are two sides of the same coin for the values and feminist consciousness of Republican women. In discussions that happened in Armagh Jail, it is clearly advocated for IRA soldiers who had children who were pregnant while serving their sentences, as much as they did for those who did not have children and wanted different options for fertility control. Through their menstrual protests, the feminist literature they read, the conversations they had within the prison space, and their art and self-imaging, women articulated a demand for the recognition of female soldiers and soldiers who were mothers or volunteers that wanted to discuss abortion, contraception, and homosexuality while fighting for a cause that has been dominated with Catholic nationalism throughout its history. In blending the militancy of armed republicanism with the needs of Irish women, mothers, and soldiers, the women in Armagh, through their prison craft and later their bodily protests and the self-imaging that they crafted, articulated iconographies that embraced gender difference as a necessary part of republicanism, creating a space for women, mothers, and soldiers in the new Ireland they were fighting for. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching this talk, which was part of the Activism and Exclusion panel. If you haven't already, go check out the other two talks in this panel by clicking the links on screen now.